Hello and welcome to Time and Leisure. I'm Lucy Kane, and this morning we're talking to Chris Riddell, who's appearing at the Barnes Children's Literature Festival this weekend. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Lucy. When you say appearing, obviously we're all virtual now, aren't we? So I'll be sitting exactly where I'm sitting now, talking live to whoever is out there looking at their computer screens.
Of course, it's totally different this year. So everybody's going to be able to tune in from the comfort of their homes and watch you from the sofa or wherever their computer or laptop or iPad might be. So this is really unprecedented and really exciting. Have you done any of these virtual appearances before, Chris?
Do you know, I have actually, Lucy. This will be maybe my fourth time, maybe fifth. I say maybe because I've also done some readings. My son is a film student, so he stepped in during lockdown to make some films with me, which was fun, reading things. I've also done some drawing, and last weekend I spent 8 hours drawing pictures for every song at a virtual folk festival called the Pillow Fort Folk Festival. So I've had some practice.
That's amazing. So, Chris, I mean, you've got so much experience talking at festivals. You're a former children's laureate, award-winning author, amazing illustrator, and probably most famously known for Goth Girl and Ottoline series. But at the moment, you've also got the Cloud Horse Chronicles: Guardians of Magic, which is, I have to say, a brilliant book. And my daughter and myself have loved reading it. So you're going to be speaking at the Barnes Children's Literature Festival this Saturday at 3:15, which is going to be live.
That's right.
What can audiences expect?
Well, the first thing they can expect, Lucy, is not to see my slightly sort of grizzled features and my lockdown haircut. But what they'll see is my hand and a sheet of paper. So I'm going to link up my document camera to my Mac, and then I'm going to talk and draw as I go. And I will talk about the Cloud Horse Chronicles, the first book, which is the Guardians of Magic. A little bit of an introduction to the principal characters, which I will draw as I talk. And if I get a chance and we have one of those interesting scrolling messages down the side of the screen, I might be able to answer some questions, maybe do some drawings that are suggested to me. But it'll be a very drawing-based event.
That sounds exciting because your drawings are amazing. And, you know, they totally bring your stories to life with that creative detail that draws readers in even further. You've done so many amazing drawings, but do you have one favourite drawing?
Do you know, that's a really, really difficult question, Lucy.
Sorry.
I'm an illustrator who writes in order to give myself something to illustrate. So if I can find a writer to sort of do that job for me and just give me fantastic stories, I'm happy. I will illustrate. So I've worked with Neil Gaiman and for many years, Paul Stewart. And lots of other wonderful, wonderful writers. And it's a real pleasure to just be given a story and be able to illustrate it. But every so often I'll stop and think, do you know, I really fancy drawing some flying horses. And in order to draw those flying horses, what I've got to do is sit down and write my own story featuring flying horses. So at the moment, I would say, in answer to that very difficult question, my favourite illustration, I think, is at the very beginning of Cloud Horse Chronicles, and it is of some cloud horse foals in their nest. They've just hatched from their eggs, and because it's a story all about flying horses, I thought it would be really nice to start with the sort of hatching of these characters. I really did enjoy doing that illustration.
That sounds amazing. And I'm going to have to go back and have a look at that drawing. I'm sure we would have seen it like 10 times over while we read your book. Last week in the park, my 9-year-old daughter declared that she'd like to be Goth Girl. So I wanted to know, you know, what is your secret to creating characters? You're an illustrator first, but you have this incredible ability to create characters that are fantastical and children fall in love with.
Lucy, you're very kind. I think I really began thinking about first Ottoline and then after that, Ada Goth from Goth Girl, because I used to tell stories to my daughter, Katie. When we weren't reading books together, sometimes I would just make up stories to tell her. And I think both Ottoline and Ada reflect, I think, Katie's personality. And what I wanted to do is write some stories for, for girls, but the sort of story a father would write for his daughter. So if you, I'm not sure you've noticed, Lucy, but both in Ottoline and in the Goth Girl books, there's a worrying lack of parental supervision. The father is absent for almost the entire story. I wonder whether I was working out some of my own issues, I think. But it comes from that place, as we were talking about, of really illustrating the things that I want to illustrate. And in order to do that, the best way is to write my own stories. So you'll notice, both in the Ottoline and the Goth Girl books, that there are lots and lots of pictures. Give me a choice, I'll always have an illustration rather than a page of prose.
That's amazing. And I was going to ask, what's your journey to becoming such a successful author and illustrator? You might have part answered it by the fact that, you know, it's obviously coming from a place of being an illustrator first, but there must have been a journey that's taken you to this position where, you know, you have your successful series. And
well, there's certainly been a journey, Lucy. I would say to young people who are interested in sort of pursuing a career in certainly children's books, but in illustration more widely, I say get a sketchbook. Go out to your local art store or your local bookshop and buy a sketchbook. There are many fantastic books out there, blank pages, and just fill it up with drawings. Draw anything, draw every day, and draw anything that comes to your mind. If you can't think of anything to draw, then draw yourself trying to think of something to draw. You see, you can never go wrong. There's always some, something you can do. And just get into that habit of drawing every day. Don't show it to anyone. That's quite important. This isn't for teachers. This isn't for, professors of any sort. It's your own personal space. It's almost like a diary. Keep it for yourself. If you want to show people, that's lovely as well. But just really concentrate on drawing for the sheer sort of pleasure of it. And I think after a while, you'll find that, you start to develop your own style. You'll look at things and think, I've been drawing unicorns for months now. Maybe I'm that person who draws unicorns or dragons or likes to draw people on the bus. There are all sorts of ways into this. But to learn that sort of habit of drawing every day in the sketchbook, I think, is where it all begins.
Do you ever get to the stage where you feel like you've drawn, not everything you could possibly draw, but that sort of that moment where you're blank, like you've drawn 6 horses that day, or
Of course you get to those points, and when you do, I think always draw the thing opposite you, or put down a pencil and pick up a blunt stick and dip it in some ink and draw. There are always ways, I think, to sort of take yourself forward. Sometimes when I can't think of anything else to draw, I will just make a blot on a page, see what that looks like, and draw something around it. So there are lots of different strategies you can use. But if you keep filling up those pages, what will happen is stories will start to find you. Characters will start to find you. You'll draw I actually drew Ottoline and Mr. Munro before I knew who they were. And I drew a little girl, and I drew a sort of small hairy figure next to her. And I thought, my goodness, I want to know who these people were. And so I gave them each a name, and I started to think, well, they must have some story. And I started to think up what story that might be. And it all started from a picture.
That's really interesting. So you started with the character. Luella, my daughter, wanted to ask a question. How do you come up with such good stories? So maybe this is your starting point in terms of you started with a character. How did you develop that into the Ottoline?
I think, developing stories, and it's a lovely question, by the way, I always start visually. To get to know my characters, I draw them and I name them. before I've got any clear idea of what the story might be. And what happens when you draw something is you ask yourself questions. Why is Ottoline wearing that type of coat? Why is Mr. Munro called Mr. Munro, even though he quite clearly isn't a sort of gentleman, sort of Victorian gentleman? He's something else. How did he come by that name? And you ask these questions, and that'll lead you into a story, just bit by bit. And I think, where do they live? Well, draw an apartment and start to put things in that apartment. And then you start to think about why there are teacups and teapots on one shelf, and why there are very, very small pictures in very, very large frames on the wall. And you start to tell yourself stories as you draw. And then the really difficult bit begins, where you have to sit down and actually write those sentences. But fortunately, I have the aid of wonderful people called editors, and they come along and help me with my spelling and my sentences, and they turn my sort of scribblings into something that actually sounds like a story, and I couldn't do it without them.
Oh, thank goodness for editors. I know they pull it all together, don't they? But the interesting bit is that story, that it sounds like it's a road of discovery in a way, that you've kind of pieced together bits and pieces to kind of create this story that happens and unfolds.
Yes, I think very much so. And I keep a sketchbook that I call sort of illustrations in search of a story. And they're just drawings I do, just from my imagination. I'm often not, I don't work out what I'm going to draw. I'll start in one corner and end in the other. And before I know it, there's a wizard sitting in a chair, and there's an owl perched on his armchair, and maybe there's a sort of spell book that he's dropped on the floor. And then I sort of post that up and invite people to write stories that those illustrations suggest to them. And my ambition one day, Lucy, is to do a series of completely unconnected pictures, and for a writer to pick them up and write a story completely around them. So in a way, illustrating the book before there's even a story. I think that's an ambition of mine.
I think there would be a lot of writers who would love to take it. That's like a writer's dream, isn't it? You know, you've created some sort of roadmap, and it's how to create a story. And I can imagine there'd be hundreds and thousands of children who could probably create the most fantastical stories out of that series of pictures with their amazing imaginations.
It's the way you start, isn't it? I think the problem is always, how do I start? And the best way is not to think too much about it, but just to jump in there. And the best way to jump in, I think, is a visual cue.
Yeah, even if it's a blot, as you say. So you've given them some great advice for aspiring young writers. I know that you do a drawing every day, don't you? You have a note.
I do.
Can I put you on the spot? Have you done a drawing today?
Yes, I have.
And do you have that? Do you have it at your desk today? Is there any chance that we could get a?
Do you know? I'm looking around, and that's sort of slightly. I do have it, but I think it's actually upstairs.
Okay, all right, we'll take you off the spot.
Oh no, you mustn't. Let me just call for assistance. Joe, could you get my sketchbook from upstairs? My sketchbook from upstairs. Yes, I think I just left it on the side.
Oh, thank you.
Assistance is coming. I will show you what I drew today. I wake up in the mornings and turn on the radio, and often get absolutely furious at what I'm listening to. And so to avoid shouting at the radio, what I do is I keep a sketchbook at all times. And as I'm listening to the Today programme and something comes up, instead of shouting at the radio, I'll just do a little picture. And that makes me feel better. It's my daily therapy before I start illustrating and doing other things. And I can just hear my wife coming down the... and here we have my sketchbook.
Here we have it, hot off the press from today.
I call it my 5 years sketchbook.
Amazing. Look at that drawing.
And I do a drawing every day. I've got to say, some of them have been rather sort of doomy, but this, as an exclusive, is today's. And wow. That is chlorinated chicken and hormone-treated piece of beef. And they're just quietly sneaking into the country because we've all been very distracted by other things.
This is true. So it says, excellent, they're distracted. We'll creep in before they notice.
Absolutely. That's a
That's
little
on this,
politics.
yeah, things kind of happening whilst we're all kind of preoccupied. That meanwhile the Brexit operations are taking place, and before we know it, we'll see all sorts of unusual foods on our shelves in the
I
supermarket.
do hope not, which is the other reason for drawing that.
That's brilliant. And you briefly touched on, you know, this is your morning therapy. What does a day in the life of Chris Riddell look like?
Well, after I've drawn a sketch in my 5-year sketchbook, I will get up, go downstairs. I'll have a cup of coffee. I might draw something at the breakfast table. Sort of, read the newspaper. Then what I'll do is I'll open my kitchen door and walk down my path, my garden path. And sort of halfway down the garden path, I'll stop and think, I better get dressed. So I'll go back inside, get dressed, come down, have another cup of coffee, spend some more time doing a little sort of doodle or drawing. Then I will finally get out of the house, walk down my garden path, which leads down to the bottom of the garden to a clump of trees. The path sort of dog legs round the corner, and there is an old coach house. Used to have a carriage and horses in it many years ago, and that is my studio. And I go into my studio at the bottom of my garden. I close the door, I sit down, and I start drawing. And so I spend all day drawing things, illustrating books, drawing commissions, that sort of thing. It's hard work, Lucy, I've got to say. It's grueling work. At the end of the very long day, I will shut my studio. I'll come back along the garden path, back into the house, sit down, and of course I need to relax. And so what I do is I pick up my sketchbook and I start to draw to relax. So I'm not quite sure when I'm working and when I'm not working. It's just the context that changes, either on the sofa or in my studio.
Well, I guess it's that moment where you realise it's a calling in life, isn't it? You've got probably some jobs that you have to do, where you have a door that you open, you go in and you do some jobs, and then you close the door. But actually, you've already done, an amazing drawing before you've kind of got out of bed, and then, like you say, and your family must be used to just seeing you permanently with a pencil and notebook in your hand and sketching away. And
I do have drawing materials all over the house, and I'm often losing my favourite pen. That causes my family great hilarity, where I can't find that pen that I put down. But apart from that, when I'm not sort of, drawing in sketchbooks and things, I find other things to draw on. So my latest thing that I enjoy doing is drawing on loo rolls.
Amazing. So we've got the rabbit.
That's the White Rabbit from Alice in Wonderland. And so I get to sort of draw all sorts of, become a bit of an obsession. So on my bedside table, it's now crowded with little loo roll illustrations. I must have about sort of 50 of them so far. That's what lockdown can do to you. But again, it's part of my therapy.
That's one of the best uses I've seen for a toilet roll holder, much better than the spaceships we've been making at home during lockdown. Chris, it's been absolutely lovely talking to you this morning, and we'll be tuning in on Saturday at 3:15 to hear more about the drawings that you're going to be doing, more from your stories, and I know that possibly you might be taking questions as well. So
I'll do my best.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you on Saturday at the Barnes Children's Literature Festival. Thanks for your time seeing us today.
Thank you.
All the best. Bye.
Bye.